We like to think that America is a democratic country that has two parties which are highly different, with political polarization at an all-time high, in which Republicans and Democrats can't seem to get along or get anything done. At least that's how it may seem on the surface. For some, Democrats are thought of as a lesser of two evils. Others believe that the Democrats are not the party that they once were, and have abandoned the working class since Bill Clinton and the rise of neoliberalism under the New Democrats, as people like Robert Reich and Chris Hedges argue in books like The Death of the Liberal Class. But what if I told you that the Democrats were never a leftist party, never a workers' party, and were always looking out for the interests of the rich, just as the Republicans were? In this video, I would like to present you with a radically alternative view of politics that most people are not exposed to, as mainstream political discourse is dominated by a one-dimensional lens of looking at politics. Most people, especially in North America, are mainly exposed to a select few parties and only a few ideologies that may seem different on the surface but are actually historically very similar. And what is possible within the existing system is only what you are exposed to, and you are expected to choose sides from what you are given. But the wave of populism in the last few years has made people very sick of the status quo, and the Republicans have adapted to this by providing people with a pseudo-populism under Trump, and the Democrats have simply failed to tap into that. But what if I told you that the Democrats are not dumb, they are not making mistakes, and that both parties, the Republicans and Democrats, play a systemic role in upholding the capitalist system? This economic system is why we have billionaires and now trillionaires who own more than the bottom half of all Americans combined. These three billionaires include Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Jeff Bezos, who all coincidentally vote Democrat, which may come to a surprise for many people. Before getting into why this is the case, there are some crucial things to understand. See, capitalism is not just an idea on how to best govern the world. Capitalism was never invented to be egalitarian or to be a just system. Capitalism was developed through the revolution of the bourgeois class under feudal societies. It was never meant to be beneficial for the worker, but rather for the bourgeoisie. Societies are not run just by a battle of ideas, and that people debate different ideas, and the ones that are the best are decided upon to govern our society. This is not how societies are actually run. The idea that different political parties have different perspectives on which mode of governance is best for the people is a very naive view of politics, and this is known as idealism. Idealism in the philosophical sense does not mean optimistic. What it refers to is the assumption that ideas are what dictate historical events and changes, rather than the material economic conditions. This is the view of a lot of liberal theorists and the main ideology that dominates political discourse today. The ultimate function of both parties, whether their actors are aware of it or not, is to preserve the same capitalist system, which mainly benefits capitalists, not workers. And that's why some people have even gone as far as to call the United States a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. See, social democratic policies like labor rights and social programs are not just taken up for ideological reasons. They are implemented only when the capitalist class is in danger of being overthrown, and in which the working class must be pacified in order for the capitalist system to sustain itself. When the capitalist class is not threatened by large labor movements and left-wing parties, there is no need to take up these kind of pro-labor welfare state policies. This is the view posited by structural Marxism, which is a neo-Marxian school of thought. Now wait for a second. If you are skeptical of Marxism or somehow associate him with the Soviet Union, then everything you know about Marx is most likely wrong. And Marxism and Leninism are completely different things, and whatever you have heard about the Soviet Union, some of it might be true, most of it probably false or exaggerated, does in no way invalidate Marx's analysis of capitalism. So whatever you have heard about or think of state socialism has nothing to do with what Marx actually said about capitalism. Hell, you don't even have to be a communist to realize that a lot of Marx's theories are very valid and useful. Now, what exactly is structural Marxism? Structural Marxism is a form of Marxism that emerged after World War II and largely pioneered by Nicholas Poulantzas and Louis Althusser, who I will probably go into more depth in a future video, especially regarding his theories on ideology. Structural Marxists view the state in a capitalist mode of production as taking a specifically capitalist form, not because particular individuals are in powerful positions who dictate everything, but because the state reproduces the logic of the capitalist structure in its economic, legal, and political institutions. From a structuralist Marxist perspective, one would argue that the institutions and the laws of the state function intentionally for the long-term interests of capital and this capitalist system as a whole, rather than solely for the short-term interests of the members of the capitalist class. This is often where most conspiracy theories about elites controlling everything tend to go very wrong. It is not just a bunch of billionaires and powerful politicians that control everything, but rather capitalism as a system has an entire logic of its own, and rather these billionaires and politicians are simply actors in that system, and happen to be the beneficiaries of the system who play a hand in reproducing the logic of capitalism. Capital in its material form and in the ideology that rationalizes its production are what dictate the decisions and outcomes of politics, not just a couple of elite politicians or Illuminati billionaire conspirators who are looking out for their own short-term interests. Structuralist Marxism developed in opposition to instrumental Marxism, which was popularized by figures like Ralph Miliband, who see politicians as more explicit servants of the ruling class, positing that policymakers in government and people in positions of power tend to share a common business or class background, which ultimately causes their decisions to be in favor of their own class interests. Basically, the instrumentalist position is that institutions of the state are under direct control of those members of the capitalist class and in positions of state power. Whereas the structuralist position is that state institutions and laws exist in order to reproduce the capitalist mode of economy as a whole. Material conditions produced by capitalism and the political actions needed to perpetuate it come before the political ideology, according to this view. And ideology is merely used to rationalize the structure that already exists. When putting on the structural Marxist goggles, it would be silly to assume that people like Reagan were single-handedly responsible for bringing in neoliberalism and the mass inequality that we see today, or that Trump was single-handedly responsible for the failure to deal with COVID. Rather, capitalism as a system is what is to be blamed, as capitalism creates the conditions that create these outcomes and make them somewhat inevitable, and politicians are merely actors that perpetuate the system, and capitalists are those that stand to benefit from it. Many capitalists probably don't believe that they are manipulating the public and controlling all of society. They themselves are probably under the same spell of ideology which rationalizes the ridiculous, broken, and unjust system which they just happen to benefit from. It's not just that we have bad leaders in power and good billionaires and bad billionaires, and that the solution is to replace the bad leaders with good ones. Rather, capitalism as a system incentivizes people to be greedy opportunists in order to move up the cutthroat corporate ladder, and the structure of government and its overarching capitalist ideology attracts the most power-hungry sociopaths to run for office. This is why rhetoric towards guillotining billionaires like Jeff Bezos is a little bit elementary, and we should not be blaming individuals, but rather critiquing the system which creates these individuals. This is what social democratic solutions like taxing billionaires tend to miss, as they tend to not to really see what creates and allows these billionaires to accumulate so much wealth in the first place. The structural Marxist view of society and politics is fundamentally incompatible with liberal ideology because they tend to see things in terms of great man theory and history as an evolution of ideas. This is where even people like Adam Curtis and Oliver Stone documentaries tend to go horribly wrong, even though I am a big admirer of their work and they make fantastic documentaries, but they tend to show the progression of income inequality and neoliberalism, and history as a whole as an evolution of neoliberal ideas introduced by people like the Chicago School and politicians like Ronald Reagan, who took hold in politics and throughout institutions and spread their ideas, which ultimately led to the neoliberal system we have. Whereas a Marxist would instead argue that these ideas were mainly used just to legitimize the inevitable evolution of capitalism, and that is global state capitalism, in which capital infects and takes over all aspects of life, everywhere, and everything is privatized, everything is commodified. The evolution of neoliberalism can be looked at through the Marxian model of the base and the superstructure. The base is the material conditions which come first, and the superstructure is the ideology that justifies and rationalizes the economic order so that the system can appear rational or, in many cases, natural. That's why many people who have objections to opposing capitalism say it's just human nature. Human nature is greedy. Capitalism fits exactly with human nature. It's natural. The main difference with a structural Marxist is that they would see ideology and the base economic conditions as equally important. But the base would still come first. The class conflict comes first, and the institutions which perpetuate the ideology, which rationalizes the economic order, keep it all in place. So what does this all mean? Well, this method of analysis severely contradicts the liberal notion that history is changed by ideas alone, and that you could simply fix things by getting the right people in power. See, neoliberalism was not a bug in the system or a result of a couple of evil men. It's not crony capitalism. Neoliberalism is the inevitable path of capitalism, without the left having a strong labor resistance to combat it. By its very nature, capitalism is meant to grow exponentially, which inevitably requires the privatization and commodifications of all aspects of life. This is why I think it is very misleading to say that neoclassical economics failed. This buys into the notion that neoliberals actually believe that their policies such as tax cuts, deregulation, privatization, and the cutting of social programs would actually help people in the long run, and that the wealth would somehow trickle down to the bottom. You have to be naive to even believe that people actually believe this. Neoliberal economics should not be viewed as a failure because it achieved exactly what it was intended to achieve, and that is a redistribution of wealth to the upper class. Now back to the question, why do many billionaires, some of the richest billionaires in fact, tend to vote Democrat when supposedly Democrats are left-wing? First off, it is absolutely ridiculous to think that billionaires are somehow left-wing and fund groups like Antifa, which is not even a group by the way, which George Soros is often accused of, despite the fact that he played a massive role in the bringing down of state socialism in many East Bloc countries. While some billionaires, like the ones mentioned, tend to vote Democrat, look at how they reacted to actual progressives like Bernie Sanders, who wanted to introduce a wealth tax.
Now, there is some muddy areas. When you start to say there shouldn't be any billionaires, that you have some cap on wealth or something like that, that goes beyond what I think, and you could say I'm self-interested, but...
Really?
See, these billionaires would support a liberal like Obama, who will raise taxes and regulations in areas that don't actually affect them. When politicians like Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Justin Trudeau in Canada say that they're going to raise taxes on the rich, what they actually mean is that they're only going to raise income taxes. Income taxes don't actually affect the billionaire class. Why? Because most billionaires don't actually make money from an income. Incomes are usually a small proportion of these billionaires' wealth, which is usually just their CEO salary. Billionaires and millionaires tend to make most of their money from things like stocks, investments, land, real estate, ownership in a company. And taxes are already quite low on things like capital gains and real estate inheritance. These slightly higher income taxes really just affect the petit bourgeois class, people who make high incomes like doctors, lawyers, manager positions. But wealth taxes, which tax wealth, that does threaten the capitalist class, and that's why they were freaking the hell out about Bernie, even though he wasn't even introducing socialism and just a left form of social democracy. But if the Republicans support aggressively deregulatory policies which actually benefit the rich even more in the short term, such as deregulations and tax cuts, then why do still many billionaires actually vote Democrat? Well, because stabilizing the system, which the Democrats do much more effectively by having better international relations and capitalism with a friendly face, provides stability to the very same system that allowed these billionaires to get rich in the first place, which would ultimately benefit them a lot more than some short-term tax cuts would. However, this was not always the same throughout history. In post-World War II, the welfare state capitalism, regulations were much harsher and taxes were a lot higher, and many rich people were actually against it. But yet, the post-World War II welfare state capitalism model was imposed on them, and not because of some egalitarian ideology, but simply because it was a system of economic checks and balances that protected the long-term interests of the capitalist order. Structural Marxists argue that the state and its institutions function to preserve the long-term interests of the capitalist system and capitalists alike, rather than just the short-term interests of members of the capitalist class. The state serves as a mechanism for regulating class conflict. It is important to differentiate the long-term and short-term interests of the capitalist class in order to describe the necessity of the state to the capitalist system. The short-term interests of the capitalist class include policies that affect capital accumulation in the immediate future, such as tax breaks, reduced minimum wages, government subsidies, bailouts, etc. Structural Marxists argue that when the state does not directly benefit the capitalist class's short-term interests, they are acting on behalf of their future long-term interests, policing capital for its own good, if you want to look at it that way. Accordingly, when the state seems to act on behalf of the proletariat, the working class, by raising minimum wages, increasing the rights of workers, taxing the rich, adding regulations, nationalizing industries, introducing new government programs, etc., it is actually serving the capitalist class's long-term interests by meeting the demands of the workers only enough to prevent an uprising that could actually threaten the disruption of the system as a whole. Because the interests of the capitalist class and the proletariat, who capitalism needs in order to function because they do all the work, are counter to one another, so the state is a necessary arbitrator in order to regulate the capitalist system and assure its preservation by forcing capitalists to agree on some demands with workers in which they would otherwise not really want to succumb to. Take a minute to think about this for a second. In a situation in which capital is about to collapse due to its own innate contradictions, a government can do one of three things. 1. It could do nothing and risk the prospect of a revolution or at least some uprisings. 2. It could shut down these uprisings and these revolts and crush dissent with a totalitarian fascist government, as the US did by backing various dictators in South America, and even in its own country under Woodrow Wilson and its anti-free speech laws and jailing leaders of the Socialist Party. Or 3. The government could regulate class antagonisms through government programs, workers' rights, and some regulatory measures, rather than having them be eliminated completely, which would ultimately risk the prospect of the capitalist class losing their power entirely. And in turn, this would stabilize the capitalist system as a whole and preserve its existence, which would end up benefiting the rich in the long run. Which approach a capitalist state chooses to take heavily depends on how class-conscious and military-equipped the population is. In America, people are armed, but class consciousness has been as low as ever, which is one of the reasons why governments have gotten away with doing absolutely nothing to ameliorate class conflict or deal with public material concerns. This form of analysis is especially important when considering how policy is made and has a lot of examples to draw upon throughout history. See, both the Democrats and Republicans are not super different on an ideological level. Rather, they both do the most to benefit capital to the extent which their voters will allow for it. A likely rebuttal to this would be that the Democrats have enacted more progressive pro-worker policies than the Republicans, at least over the last 100 years. However, most of these changes were implemented because they had to, and did so strategically with the goal of prolonging the capitalist order. There are many good historical examples of this. The boldest, most transformative set of policies implemented by the Democratic Party was arguably the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, which gave people medical care, social security, a higher minimum wage, and a guaranteed job. While there's a narrative that the Democratic Party graciously came up with this progressive idea as part of a new ideology to benefit the people, Roosevelt actually himself argued that he did so to save capitalism, and to ultimately prevent a workers' revolution. After the 1929 Great Depression, the capitalist order was in great danger, and people were starving and taking it to the streets. And keep in mind, the Russian Revolution of 1917 took place only 10 years prior, so it was not exactly a distant memory. Rather than waiting for the recession to fix itself over time, as Herbert Hoover tried, which only led to more mass striking and instability to the capitalist system, the Roosevelt administration was elected by promising to give workers aid through government programs and spending, which helped the Democrats steal many votes from the Socialist Party and easily beat the Republicans, and even more importantly, were able to maintain the capitalist order. Even though the rich had to make a few concessions through some regulations and a higher tax rate, which were never really fully paid by the way, it was still a more worthwhile deal for them to take, which was better than risking the prospect of a revolution or even a democratically elected socialist party. After decades of Democrats in power, the Republicans under Dwight Eisenhower found themselves to be elected only through following the New Deal consensus, which everyone supported at the time and was the only way to stabilize the capitalist world order. And all of the Democrats and Republicans' supposed ideological differences were set aside, with the exception of a few social issues. Roosevelt's reforms actually benefited the capitalist class in the long term. There was a massive economic boom in which the rich got richer, except that the slice of the overall economic pie wasn't as disproportionately uneven as it was in the 1920s. However, in the 1970s, after the post-World War boom started to deflate, as all booms do, with economic stagnation and high inflation rates that threatened the savings accounts of the rich, and the capitalist class were soon able to turn the state in their favor to redistribute wealth and privatize industries that would put them in an even more dominant position than they were in the 1920s. It is also important to note that Franklin Roosevelt was not the first time in which the US government had to step in to prevent capitalism from self-destructing. The Republicans also did this between the 1890s and the early 1900s, when the Republicans were actually still the progressive party compared to the Democrats who were latching on to segregation. Under Theodore Roosevelt's Republican Party, monopolies that dominated industries such as oil, railways, and big banks, which were all owned by John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Vanderbilt, were broken up and new regulations were introduced in order to stabilize the capitalist system. But from a liberal historical stance, this is often looked at as a measure to reduce inequality as part of an egalitarian ideology. During this time, strikes were getting so prominent to the point where Rockefeller went as far as to hire private militias to mow down dissenting workers, and government had to inevitably introduce some labor laws that would at least make it so that workers weren't full-on slaves, and some antitrust regulations so that you wouldn't end up in monopoly capitalism all too quickly, and that the system could at least exist longer to reproduce itself and be more stable, and ultimately give people the illusion of free choice. But like all social democratic reforms, these were gradually undone, and the cycle seems to keep repeating itself. This doesn't just apply to economic policy, it applies to social policy as well. Take for example the Civil Rights Act, in which even the Democrats at the time were unwilling to implement until after $65 million in property damage was inflicted from the riots after Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered. Progressive policies are not implemented by a capitalist state unless they benefit the long-term or short-term interests of capitalism. This brings me to my last point, which is that the difference between Republicans and Democrats and the main parties of capitalist states really boils down to what they can get away with while still supporting the capitalist world order without still losing too many of their voters. Democrats and Republicans have different voter bases. Republicans have more conservative, religious voters who are generally less class conscious and care more about symbolic traditions and social issues than many Democratic voters, which consists more of minorities and younger voters. Because they face less resistance from their supporters, Republicans can simply get away with being a lot worse. At the end of the day, neither the policies of the Democrats or Republicans threaten the upper billionaire class, which is one of the reasons why billionaires still vote Democrat, as they won't stand to lose anything and will actually get greater stability in return, which in turn will affect the stability of the stock market. Interestingly, the stock market has actually historically done a little bit better under Democrats in comparison to Republicans. The reasons for this are debated, and one of the reasons is probably because Democrats tend to clean the messes that Republicans made and give more stability to the overall system.
And it just seems that the economy does better under the Democrats than the Republicans. Now, it shouldn't be that way. But if you go back, I mean, it just seems that the economy does better under the Democrats.
So having said all that, how come people haven't revolted? Or at the very least, elected a social democratic reformist, given the economic conditions are looking very much like that of the 1920s, and inequality is getting as large as ancient Egypt? One of the simple reasons for this is ideology. Decades upon decades of Cold War Red Scare propaganda have made us believe that the free market is always right, and that any pro-worker policy or even any government policy is equivalent to totalitarianism, and the death of millions and trillions and billions. Like I said, political parties in a capitalist state will only do as much as they have to, and it will take a lot of direct action in order to force them to do so. Over the past few decades, right-wing voters have seemingly let their politicians get away with absolutely anything, and leftist voters have been always put into this position where they are strong-armed to vote for a Democrat which they don't like, who does not support working-class interests, because they are the lesser of two evils. This has been happening for ages. If people always pledge their support to Democrats all the time, then voters will lose any leverage that they ever had. And the Democratic Party will keep getting away with neglecting the interests of workers. And this is all despite the pandemic and catastrophic economic collapse in which unemployment is at its highest it's ever been in a very long time. The Democrats have still not embraced universal healthcare, UBI, or won't even ban fracking to at least ameliorate the catastrophic impact of climate change. On the contrary, Biden seemed to be campaigning to the right to win over Republicans. Why do people keep buying into the idea that there is such political polarization despite the obvious corporate duopoly? The US media, which is profit-driven and incentivized to over-sensationalize things as much as possible to make more profit, makes party feuds and differences seem a lot greater than they actually are. Jean Baudrillard, a favorite thinker of this channel, talks about how the power of the US empire is actually maintained through a system of binary oppositions. A genius form of maintaining power that is actually far more effective than any dictatorship could ever be. The illusion of choice and the symbolic balance of power stabilizes a monolithic empire that any centralized dictatorship would really fail to do. The system of binary oppositions exists throughout the cultural realm of everyday life, not just politics. It exists in sports, rival monopolies of commodities and various companies. But that is subject for another video on the culture industry, which will be coming out rather soon. Finally, to conclude, we should forego the idealist perception of politics and history in which parties are motivated by different ideas and beliefs, and rather that economic conditions and motives come before ideology, and the purpose of ideology is to rationalize economic conditions. There are no polar opposite political parties. There's no real polarization, only manufactured polarization. There is a dictatorship of the capitalist class. To combat this, there can be no political unity. The parties are already united in their goals to benefit the capitalist class. There can only be class unity, in which allegiances towards political parties are withdrawn in favor of coming together based on a mutual economic interest to abolish arbitrary class distinctions and build a society that works for all. Thank you for watching this video, and to those who helped on it. These types of videos take a lot of time and resources to make, so if you could support this channel on Patreon, that would be fantastic, and I would be able to keep putting out videos just as good as this more often. $5 patrons will have access to the exclusive podcasts that I put out following every video in which I explain a rather complex concept. I, along with another guest, will be explaining in further detail about the concepts discussed in this video, so if you're into the more learning part of these videos and would like to understand these concepts a lot more, podcasts can be a lot more helpful than videos can, so you can go check those out. Thank you so much for supporting me. Peace!